Conservatism, that is, real conservatism, has not just been defeated, it has been abolished. Perhaps not in whole, but at least in part, in very large part. That thing that passes for conservatism in the modern conception is just liberalism. It's false to refer to it as any type of conservatism. The only thing it's trying to conserve is, as many of these so-called conservatives claim, liberalism itself. But when I say conservatism, what I'm referring to is the actual deep Western tradition that goes back over 2,000 years. The coherent line of thought that can be traced back from ancient Greece to this day, even if it only exists currently in books and in those who have no real political power. This tradition was traded for cheap libertarian platitudes. The line from liberalism, that is, classical liberalism, to socialism is a straight line. That does not necessarily mean that one has to turn into the other, but it does mean that it's not incredibly difficult for one to turn into the other. That's because both are fundamentally about the same freeing from constraints, and it's not a massive leap in logic to go from the initial freeing of the constraint of the government to the radical freeing of the constraints of reality that socialism is about. This trade of liberals pretending to be conservatives or conservatives becoming liberals has occurred at least in part because it's much easier to justify conservative opinions in a liberal framework because of the cultural dominance of the left. I do think these people are still in some fundamental way conservative, and I do identify them as my people in a certain way. I do believe they fundamentally want the same sort of conservative society that I want. But even when it comes to core conservative issues like, say, abortion, they don't justify their position on the evil of the act. They justify their position on the liberty of the fetus. Now, I can hardly fault these people for trying to work within the framework that they're given. But the point is that this is how conservatives try to justify everything that they do. It's not just limited to one or two things. They've forced into this framework, and I'm not going to pretend this is their fault, but this is why conservatism is so neutered. As long as conservatives believe that the only type of freedom that matters is freedom from the government or some type of external actor, we can't win, because that's trying to play the left at their own game. It's buying in to the fundamental left wing, to the fundamental Enlightenment premise that the issues that man faces are imposed on him from the outside, and that all that is necessary is some sort of liberation from that. The form that liberation takes, whether it's from radical libertarianism, radical communism, or something in between those two, doesn't really matter, because it's agreeing to the fundamental notion that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. The greatest tyrant that man faces is internal, not external. What the left is rebelling against isn't any one particular system, but reality itself. And this is where Kanye West comes in. He's been all over the headlines recently because of his supposed presidential bid, and at this point it's still unclear how serious exactly that will turn out to be. And he's been very divisive in various right-wing circles, with some saying that he's just crazy, and others saying that he's just speaking the truth. The reality is probably somewhere in between those two. I honestly have a hard time seeing how someone could not understand that he clearly has some mental health problems. But the trope of the emperor who has no clothes, and it only being spotted by the child, or in our case, perhaps a man who is not totally there, is a trope for a reason. And it appears that Kanye West has been one of the very few people in our age who has managed to rediscover the actual meaning of conservatism and freedom. The moment in question occurred during his presidential rally in South Carolina last week, around the beginning, though in a scene that hasn't been nearly as publicized as many other parts of it were, both on social media and in the regular media itself.
But when God calls Moses, he has to leave his comfy job, working for the Egyptians, and free the people. And the freedom does not come from an election. The freedom comes from you not loading up pornography. The freedom comes from you not taking the Percocet. The freedom comes from you not downing your brother and your sister. The freedom comes from you putting that gun down and not shooting people at the gas station. It has nothing to do with this election. It only has to do with God and calls for us that we have a moment to breathe. It has nothing to do with black, white, rich, poor, red, blue, Native American, pilgrim. It has to deal with being truthful to what God has.
That's it. I barely even need to expand on it. Kanye West has a far deeper and a far more conservative view of freedom than almost the entirety of so-called conservative politicians and of much of the so-called conservative pundit class. This isn't the libertarian platitude of freedom, that freedom is when you get the government out of things. Freedom is when you're no longer a slave. Freedom is when you are free from your vices. Freedom is when you are free from what is tyrannizing you. And that's just as likely, if not more likely, to be internal rather than external. Kanye knows this very well because, like many boys these days, he was exposed to dirty imagery at a very young age, which resulted in something that affected him for the rest of his life. This view of freedom that Kanye West is talking about is the same view of freedom that St. Augustine talked about when he said that a man has as many masters as he has vices. To go a bit deeper into that quote, it begins with St. Augustine comparing the lots of two men, one rich and one poor, the rich being a king who has all the luxuries he could possibly want, but also many, many vices, and the poor who has no such luxuries, yet he is free from all vices. The poor man may be the slave to the richer, but the richer is the slave to himself, and the poor man only has one master, while the rich man has a million. This example that St. Augustine gives us is particularly instructive, because it really destroys the leftist conception of liberty, again, whether that's the liberal perspective or the socialist perspective. The rich and depraved king should have all the liberty in the world. He is certainly free from government restraints, since he is the government, and he is free from oppression, since he is the oppressor. Yet, in the end, he is really the one that is being tyrannized more than anyone else, tyrannized by himself, by his own vices, and by his own soul. I certainly don't think that Kanye West has been reading much of The City of God recently, and he certainly has said many cringe things and things that are very unconservative, both recently and in the past. But again, the point is that someone like him is the one that is able to rediscover what real conservatism and what real liberty is about. The fact that a man that is so troubled is the one that's able to do that is why it's so notable. This brings us back to a really serious struggle for anyone who tries to make conservative principles adapted for a society and a moral system which is completely contrary to those principles. As harsh as I am on them, I do understand conservatives who try to make their preferred policies fit into a liberal framework. Whether it's the anti-prawn people who want to try to make a feminist argument for their policy, or it's the pro-life people who try to make a liberal argument for theirs. I do understand what they're trying to do. They have very serious issues that they're trying to address, and they think using arguments using the current morality is an effective way of doing that. But the issue is, even if they could somehow get their policy through, they would only do so by confirming the existing morality. And these issues are really serious issues, so I really do understand why a conservative could even understand the problems with what they're doing, but still go ahead because they want to make any change they possibly can. But at the end of the day, the only way to really challenge the system is to actually challenge it, to actually take the moral system head on, and to one day somehow destroy it. If that's not done, all you're doing is fighting over how exactly to make liberalism work. Thanks for watching. Please donate to my Subscribestar if you enjoy this content, or check out my t-shirt store on Teespring. And please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and make sure to share these videos with anyone who you think might find it interesting. And a special thanks to my donors, Emmett Vestry, Seth Apex, King of Evil Florida and the Moon, Josiah, Adzutko, Hexorius, quo praegrenitor, and charismatic Byzantine. Thank you everyone very much for watching, and goodbye.